North Korea and the West have long been coupled in a diplomatic dance of threats and counter-threats.
We will not hesitate to use our military might.
But lately, the pace has picked up. North Korea has ignored international warnings against testing ballistic missiles to grow its nuclear program. Washington is laying out its next course of action.
The policy of strategic patience has ended. We're exploring a new range of diplomatic, security, and economic measures. All options are on the table.
The U.S.'s targeted strike last week on an airbase in Syria has been interpreted as a warning to Pyongyang that the U.S. is willing to act on its own. And now this, a U.S. Navy strike group making its way from Singapore to the Korean peninsula. In response, North Korea says it's ready to strike back. True to his style, President Trump tweeted that North Korea is looking for trouble, but that if China decides to help, that would be great. If not, we will solve the problem without them. As North Korea's closest ally and economic partner, China is under mounting pressure to use its influence. The issue dominated talks between U.S. President Donald Trump and his counterpart Xi Jinping last week. But China says regular military drills in the Pacific by the U.S., Japan, and South Korea aren't helping. And there's been a backlash against a U.S. decision to deploy the advanced THAAD anti-missile system to South Korea.
我们密切关注着半岛局势的发展，在当前形势下，我们认为有关的各方都应该保持克制，不要做加剧局势紧张的事情。
Despite words of caution, Beijing is already preparing for war on its doorstep. It sent 150,000 additional soldiers to its northern border to deal with a potential flood of refugees. As the world wonders who will blink first, many fear North Korea will revive an old tradition of using special events to display military might. This weekend, the country will celebrate the 105th birthday of its late founder, Kim Il-sung, a fitting occasion to raise the stakes. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by former U.S. Congressman John Tierney in Washington, D.C. He's the executive director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. And in the South Korean city of Gyeongju, Tristan Webb. He's the senior analyst for the news website NK Pro and used to advise the British government on North Korea. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. John Tierney, let me begin with you, sir. Is war really on the table, or is it all just bluster?
Well, I think somewhere between the two. I don't think that war is on the table, but I wouldn't say that it's just bluster. I think that it's apparently an attempt to be very calculated in making sure the pressure is brought to bear so that China will respond and take some favorable action on ramping up the sanctions and getting the attention of North Korea. Of course, everybody has to be very concerned about the uncertainty of this administration in the United States and the uncertainty of the North Korea regime as well.
Tristan Webb, the very prospect of going it alone, the United States taking unilateral action and saying, hey, China, you're not doing enough, does that scare you?
Well, yes, it does. I live in South Korea. My family is here. We are scared of the prospects of war breaking out because North Korea has frequently stated and appears to be sincere in saying that it will launch nuclear strikes against US bases in the region if so much as a single bullet crosses into its territory. There are many US bases in South Korea, and the prospect of being attacked by North Korea is never far from anyone's mind here.
John Tierney, does Donald Trump have a point that China has not done enough to rein in North Korea?
Well, certainly China could do more. We'd like it to do more. Its own interest, however, stop it from doing all the things that we would like it to do. So what Donald Trump, I hope, would recognize with his advisors that he does have in place is that we can ask for more from China, and they could presumably do more on that, but they're not going to do everything that we want them to do on that. So there's a delicate balance there. I think China is starting to step up a little bit with its seriousness. by sending the troops to the border. It's one indication that they mean business, but also making the statements they've made most recently about the fact of shutting off coal supplies and things of that nature if there isn't some act on North Korea's part to not do anything this weekend or subsequently.
Tristan, I'm curious to hear what South Koreans think about the Chinese relationship with the North and whether they think that the Chinese are too soft on North Korea or perhaps that, you know, with sanctions and so on, coal sanctions and so on, that the Chinese are doing all they can.
Yes, well, I think that raises an important question, which is that the nature of the North Korean problem depends on where you're looking at it from. And so from the US perspective, it wants China to, rein in North Korea. That's not how the Chinese view it. And the situation looks a bit different in South Korea, which sees the situation currently, well, I shouldn't say sees it as a single whole. There are many different voices here, but the dominant trend seems to be to see it as a tussle between the great powers, once again, deciding the future of the Korean Peninsula without checking in with or consulting with the powers of the Korean Peninsula themselves to decide their own future.
And of course, the North provokes. They have these mega parades, they have these drills, they test rockets and so on, and they talk big. But let me ask you, former Congressman Tierney, are the US and South Korea making it worse by having these mega drills? Aren't those also forms of provocation?
Look, I think the best resolve here would be to try and make sure that the North Korea regime doesn't overreact on that and feel that their regime is threatened. If you're going to do something here, you're going to have to strengthen and enforce the sanctions at the same time you reach out and have some engagement with North Korea. So if they want to do that, they could still have their actions over there, but they should not provoke North Korea by directing them toward North Korea. They could move them away, redirect them in other directions, sometimes not have them at all. Certainly the THAAD system that they're proposing to put there right now, I think, has no real purpose in terms of defending against anything North Korea might do, and it serves the purpose of actually provoking North Korea and making people in Japan and South Korea very concerned at the same time. So there's a lot of things the United States could do to turn down the temperature and try to move in the right direction. China is an important piece, and hopefully they're going to step up and do more than they've been doing.
Yeah, and Tristan, you touched on it earlier, you know, the existential fears in South Korea, the fact that North Korea said if a single bullet is fired, then they will retaliate. When the North sees the USS Carl Vinson, they can't be too happy. They're not going to be cowed, are they? Does that worry people in South Korea that both the South Korean government and the United States might actually be poking Kim Jong-un and it might not end well?
I think so. I think the biggest fear is not knowing how Trump might decide to take steps further. South Korean government has always been very anxious to maintain extremely close relationship with the administration in Washington. And with Trump this time, although there have been high-level meetings, it's almost impossible to say what will happen next. And this creates a lot of strategic doubt and a lot of concern on all sides about just what might happen next. Could I pick John Tierney up on something he just mentioned about potentially pausing or redirecting the focus of the US-South Korea joint exercises? Because this is something that the Chinese have put to the US administration, and so that there might be a workable deal if the US is willing to tone down, perhaps pause those exercises, then perhaps North Korea could be persuaded to put a cap on future tests.
John Tierney, is the Chinese offer reasonable?
Well, it's reasonable if they're not looking for an excuse to not do as much as they can do. That wouldn't be good. But if they're going to continue to increase what they're doing and try and make sure that North Korea understands their seriousness, then there's a point there to be made. There aren't any really great options on that, but I think most experts are going to agree that at some point engagement has to start. And if you're going to engage people, it means you're going to stop provoking them. And maybe by the United States working with South Korea in the exercises and not provoking, moving them in a different direction so that the North Korean regime doesn't feel threatened, like it has to retaliate, that's a start. And it seems like this administration, the Trump administration, might be moving in the other direction, blustering and trying to carry a big stick. But I would hope that the president would listen to some of his military advisors, the few that he has in place, and they would understand that the one thing that would set off a chain of events that would perhaps endanger everybody is if North Korea starts to feel that this regime is definitely being threatened and it is more than just provocation, that there might actually be something that makes them concerned, and then they think they would react. And that would be a serious problem for everybody.
Mr. Tierney, the hawks in the Pentagon will say, we've been there before. Christopher Hill went back and forth, 10 years ago. He tried to talk to them. He tried to reason with them. This is a regime that cannot be reasoned with. That's why we have to take them out. What would you say to that perspective?
Well, look, the hawks are never satisfied unless bullets are flying. And that's a, if there was a military plan that could lead to victory with some surety or whatever, they would be on much firmer ground. But nobody really pretends to think that this has a good result if the military gets involved and bombs start flying. We have not tried diplomacy for quite some time. In fact, the only time there were positive movements in this relationship were when diplomacy was in fact being pursued. So when the new Secretary of State indicates that he doesn't think that he's going to use diplomacy, all options are on the table. All options on the table has always been the policy, but diplomacy has been the preference on this, and I still think that it's the only way. Engagement is the only way this is going to get resolved, and you can keep your sanctions and enforce them better than you are now to make sure that the North Korea feels the seriousness of it and wants to move toward engagement in a serious way. But to move right to the military option on that without doing something that was the only thing that was effective in the past is not a good solution.
Tristan, you want to come in?
Can I just chip in on that? I completely agree. And this line that diplomacy failed, I think we really need to look again at that claim. Yes, the USA didn't get everything it wanted from diplomacy, and the North did cheat or at least test the boundaries very severely. But the USA and the region got, can I say, a hell of a lot from that diplomacy. Through the agreed framework talks, ultimately they fell apart after President Bush decided that North Korea was cheating. But during that period, there was a verifiable freeze on almost all of North Korea's nuclear tests. There was a long period of no missile development. You go and compare that period where diplomacy was seriously tried to the subsequent period of strategic patience where North Korea has had free rein to develop its nuclear and missile programs. And it's very clear that diplomacy was much more successful in getting the USA what it wanted on its wish list than strategic patience and military pressure.
So then let me ask John Tierney, do you think that this administration is capable, is it capable of pivoting and finessing that sort of diplomacy that's needed?
Well, I don't know if they're capable of finessing anything on this way. That's one of the difficulties here. Certainly, if they put the right personnel in place, there could be a capability of getting to that point. But I want to raise the point on this, that these hawks made the same argument about Iran. And when we had committee hearings and we gamed out what a war would look like with Iran, it clearly indicated that negotiations and diplomacy were the better path, and that worked out to a positive result. I think if people want to look at the war gaming of the situation, what would happen in North Korea if we went right to a kinetic basis or anything like that, they would make sure that they thought they exhausted every diplomatic avenue first. And I think the Iran agreement, the JCPOA is it's abbreviated, is a model that can be used. It won't be the same, and it won't be exact at all, but it does show that you can have sanctions in place that are effective, and you can then engage people. And while it takes a while, and it takes patience, and it takes good diplomatic skills, it can be done. The question of whether or not this administration can harness the good diplomatic skills, that's very much an open question on that, and one that we should be concerned about.
Okay, I think that's a good point to put a button. Okay, Tristan, you want to come in? 20 seconds, please.
Yeah. Can I just offer a potential ray of light, which is that Trump may not be as completely thoughtless as some fear he is in terms of strategy here. With regards to the involvement of Kissinger, who has been involved with Team Trump for several months. Kissinger has met with President Xi Jinping. Could we be seeing return to the Nixon madman theory of applying really intense military pressure and an atmosphere of, my goodness, we don't know what the president's going to do, we better give him something to, make him happy and cool off this military threat?
Yep, and for those who are too young, Nixon went to China and met with Mao and made a deal with Mao. Maybe we'll have to wait and see, but I've got to wrap. So, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. Former US Congressman John Tierney and former advisor to the UK government, Tristan Webb. Thanks so much.